Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karava Vahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvisha Vahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Where are you? There you are. Welcome to you all, and very happy New Year to you, if I haven't been able to wish you before. Nice that we can begin today. Welcome also to our many viewers watching, many students watching online. I'm especially happy to have you join us for our first Bhagavad Gita class of the new year. And nice timing, and that is last year we finished chapter 14. This year we begin chapter 15. Of course, not that it takes a whole year, but we'll have a very wonderful time, I think, studying chapter 15 because of its extraordinary content. Before we do, though, there were a couple of questions that came on chapter 14 on the three gunas. I'd like to respond to those questions very briefly here before we proceed to chapter 15. First question. So in chapter... I don't need this. Sorry, this one. Good. In chapter 14, Sri Krishna explained that human behavior is the result of the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. All human behavior, then, is natural, since sattva, rajas, and tamas are the fundamental constituents of nature, as we discussed at length. From this, we understand that human behavior is natural. Trees grow and die, that's natural. Lions prowl the jungle and eat helpless animals, natural or not. And you know where this is going. That shows human beings, too, are capable of some harmful deeds. Here's the question with regard to human nature. Is racism, murder, and war natural? When I see human beings, what they're doing to the environment, how irresponsible they are, and how neglectful about passing on to the future generations, I ask, are humans natural? Sadly, all this is in the realm of nature. It is natural for a lion to eat a defenseless animal, and it is natural for human beings to commit acts of great kindness and love, and it is equally natural for human beings to commit acts of terror and horror. Both are natural, because this is the human condition. That doesn't excuse anything, because unlike the lion, human beings have free will. The lion can't decide if it's going to be vegetarian or not. It's programmed, it's genetically programmed to eat animals. We, on the other hand, we also have a lot of genetic programming. That's just a fact, but we also have free will. And we can use that free will consistently to do the best, to follow Dharma. So there's a common confusion, may actually go back to European philosophy of the 18th century. I think Rousseau, I'm not an expert in all of this, but there was an idea back then that idealized nature. Everything in nature is wonderful. Anything natural is lovely. Is arsenic natural? Arsenic is a naturally occurring substance, and sadly, it comes up in the well water of many villagers in India and causes terrible harm. Absolutely natural. So anyway, we have to recalibrate our understanding of the word natural. Sri Krishna's definition, natural is whatever is an embodiment of sattva, rajas, and tamas. And that certainly will include acts of, as I said, acts of great altruism and kindness and love are natural, and acts of terror and murder are equally natural. Okay, last question. At the end of chapter 14, Sri Krishna described one who was guna atita, beyond the three gunas. And then he said that the one who is guna atita will be tulya, will be the same towards all, including Adi and Mitra Paksha, including will have equanimity towards enemies and friends. So based on this, the question says, Sri Krishna advocates being tulya, being the same towards friends and enemies, but he himself sided with the Pandavas. That's a clever observation, but missing a very important point. And that is, tulya is a matter of understanding. Your enemies are also human beings and deserve to be treated as such. On the other hand, your behavior must be driven by dharma. The difference between understanding on one hand and action on the other. You can whether you are enlightened. If you're enlightened, you'll see this tulya, this equalness of friends and enemies. If you're not enlightened, you may not see things in that way. But regardless of what you understand or don't understand, your behavior, whether you're enlightened or not, should always conform to dharma. So this is the answer to the question. Sri Krishna looked upon the Kauravas. We could say that Krishna, by the way, they're all family members, they're all related anyway. So we might say that Krishna was as fond of the Kauravas as he was of the Pandavas, yet he sided with the Pandavas not out of fondness, out of dharma. So this is how we can understand that properly. Okay, with that, we conclude our comments on chapter 14, and we can proceed now to chapter 15, Purushottama Yoga. Purusha Uttama. Uttama, the highest Purusha being. The highest being, Ishvara. Actually, we'll see. We'll let Sri Krishna describe who is Purushottama as that topic continues. Let's begin with some recitation. I'll mention that many of the verses in this chapter are in the longer meter. Most of the verses in the Bhagavad Gita are in the short meter, having 16 syllables in a line, 8 syllables in a quarter. These have 11 syllables in a quarter. The longer lines on a different mode of chanting. You can listen and repeat. And as always, as I'm chanting, be sure to read the translation. Any other cell phones can be turned off, please. Okay, repeat after me. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, Shri Bhagavan Urdhva get the pitch up a little bit. Urdhva Mulamadashakam, Urdhva Mulamadashakam, Ashwattham Prahuravyayam, Ashwattham Prahuravyayam, Chandansi Yasya Parnani, Chandansi Yasya Parnani, Yastam Veda Savedavata, Yastam Veda Vedavata, Adhashchodvam Prasritastasya Shakaha, Adhashchodvam Prasritastasya Shakaha, Guna Pravriddha Vishaya Pravalaha, Guna Pravriddha Vishaya Pravalaha, Adhascha Mulanyanusantatani, Adhascha Mulanyanusantatani, karmanubandhini manusyaloke karmanubandhini manusyaloke narupamasyeha tatopalabhyate narupamasyeha tatopalabhyate nanto nachadir nacha sampratishta nanto nachadir nacha sampratishta ashvattamenam suvirudhamulam ashvattamenam suvirudhamulam asangashastrena dridhena chitva asangashastrena dridhena chitva tataf parantat parimargitavyam tataf parantat parimargitavyam yasmin gata nani vartanti bhuyaha yasmin gata nani vartanti bhuyaha tameva chadyam purusham prapadye tameva chadyam purusham prapadye yatah pravrittih prasrita purani yatah pravrittih prasrita purani nirmana mohajata sangadoshaha nirmana mohajata sangadosh adhyatma nitya vinivritta kamaha adhyatma nitya vinivritta kamaha dvandvar vimukta sukha dukkha sangyar dvandvar vimukta sukha dukkha sangyar gacchantya mudha paramavyayam tata gacchantya mudha paramavyayam tata. Very good. Let's go back. And we pick this up. This chapter does not begin with Arjuna's question. This chapter begins with Sri Krishna, who has something of great importance that he wants to ensure that Arjuna understands quite correctly. And you saw in our recitation the very familiar, I think it's familiar to most of you, the metaphor of the upside-down tree, here called the Ashwatha tree. Ashwatha in India, they'll call it people tree. It's the so-called sacred fig tree. It's in the same, it's related to the banyan tree, but it's not identical. It's similar. And here we have some symbolism of this tree being upside down. And we're going to see some important symbolism in just a moment. And the reason for the symbolism, of course, sometimes you might wonder, why all this symbolism? Why can't Sri Krishna just speak directly about these sophisticated spiritual topics? And the reason is that we all recognize the limitations of language and logic. Language is very powerful. Logic is very powerful. But as all tools have limitations. Language is a powerful tool of communication. Logic is a powerful tool of understanding. All tools have limitations, and sometimes we want to find ways to go beyond the limitations of those tools. So, an effort to transcend the limitations of language and logic, one way to do so is through the use of symbolism. And here, Sri Krishna introduces the symbol of the upside-down Ashwatha tree as a symbol. Often it's called tree of life, and that sounds it sounds so nice. Oh, the tree of life. It's the tree of samsara. The tree of worldly life. The tree of getting reincarnated again and again and again into a life of suffering. Now, that tree of life doesn't sound quite so wonderful, but bear in mind that the commentator says very clearly, samsara vriksha. It's the tree of samsara, the struggle and suffering of life. And we'll see that symbolism as we continue. So with that in mind, let us begin with the first verse, which is still in the short meter, the Anushtup Chandas. Urdhva Mula Mada, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Urdhva Mula Mada Shakam, Urdhva Mula Mada Shakam, Ashwatham Prahuravyayam, Ashwatham Prahuravyayam, Chandansi Yasya Parnani, Chandansi Yasya Parnani, Yastam Vedasa Vedavata, Yastam Vedasa Vedavata. So, our symbolic tree is in the second line, it is Ashwatham. Its name is the Ashwatha tree, that sacred fig tree, people tree. Prahuhu, they call it. Who calls it the Ashwatha tree? Our scriptures call it that. The rishis call it that. The origin of this metaphor, by the way, is in the Katha Upanishad. Katha Upanishad being part of the Vedas. So Vedic scripture, the Katha Upanishad, is the first place where the symbolism is found. And they call it the Ashwatha tree, and they say it is avyayam. It is unchanging, it is eternal, and that unchanging eternal tree now begins to hint at its symbolic representation of the continual cycle of birth and rebirth. Again and again and again, born into a life of suffering. And that tree is now symbolically described as being urdhva mulam. The mula, the tree the mulam, the roots of this tree are urdhvam, above, and the shakam, the branches of this tree, are adaha, below. So here's where we get very clearly the image of this upside down tree. Why? Well, again, it's symbolism. The roots of the tree of samsara, the tree of worldly life, the roots are above in not just the skies and heaven, above in that which is unmanifest. The roots of the tree of life are above, symbolically representing, you could take it, the origin being either the unmanifest, that would be following with the teachings of Sankhya, or in keeping with the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, you'd say that the roots of the tree of life are in Brahman, absolute reality. You can take it in either sense. Where does all this come from? Where does anything come from? Nothing comes from nothing. The universe is a something. This something must come from something. In the ancient Sankhya philosophy, which we saw starting in chapter 13 and 14, we saw that the Sankhya's understood that the universe was previously in an unmanifest condition, and the unmanifest condition gave way to the manifest condition. The metaphor used again and again is seed and sprout. A sprout doesn't come from the ground. A sprout comes from the seed, right? So the seed is the origin for the sprout. The origin of the tree of samsara is above, could be that unmanifest. The unmanifest is what remains after the prior cycle of creation comes to an end. After the prior plant died, it left behind seeds. Those seeds later sprouted. The prior cycle of creation left behind a seed. That seed is called avyakta avastha, the universe in an unmanifest condition. When the universe comes to an end, it doesn't just become nothingness. Just as nothing cannot become something, something cannot become nothing. It's very obvious logic. So the prior existence of the universe was a something. That something cannot pass into utter emptiness, nothingness. So that something that was a prior universe becomes unmanifest. We can also call it bija avastha, a seed condition. So that's one way of understanding the origin of the roots of the tree of samsara being upwards, and upwards can also represent Brahman, the reality because of which anything and everything exists. But now you can understand from either standpoint. The roots are up, referring to the origin of all that exists being beyond the material world as we know it, transcendent. That transcendent origin of the tree of life is indicated by the roots being above, and the branches obviously come down into the world. This is the unmanifest becoming manifest, the seed giving rise to branches and twigs, etc. Such is the ashwatam. As I said, this metaphor originally comes in the Katha Upanishad in the Vedas. Further, the metaphor is described in this way, that the tree has parnani, leaves. And yasya parnani, the leaves of this tree of samsara are chandansi, are the verses, literally verses, but specifically verses of the Veda. Now that's obscure. I admit it. It's obscure. What do you mean? The leaves of the tree of samsara are verses from the Vedas. That on the surface seems obscure. Without a commentary, I wouldn't figure it out, honestly. But commentators make it very clear. Leaves serve many purposes for the tree, including leaves protect the tree. Leaves provide shade, and at least in ancient times, they really saw leaves as protecting the tree. They hold moisture. Well, leaves are the source of life for the tree. Even from a modern scientific standpoint, photosynthesis takes place only in those leaves. So those leaves then sustain the life of the tree. Now you can begin to make the connection to Vedic verses. So leaves protect the tree and sustain the tree. The Vedas protect human culture and sustain human culture. That's the sense of this symbolism. Yes, it's a little obscure, but now you get it. So the leaves of the tree of samsara represent the Vedas, Vedic verses, because just as leaves protect and sustain a tree, in the same way the teachings of the Vedas protect and sustain all people. Finally, yaha tam veda, yaha veda, one who knows, tam, that tree of samsara, saha vedavit, that person knows the Vedas. Now here we have the, in fact, technically it's a mixed metaphor. So one who knows the tree, which is no, it's not a mixed metaphor. Sorry, we'll just say it's all inside the metaphor. One who knows the tree of samsara knows the Vedas. So remember, the Vedas are the leaves of the tree of samsara. By knowing the tree of samsara means knowing its origin. Its origin up in the heavens. So to know the origin of that tree of samsara, to know the tree thoroughly and completely, then you know every aspect of the tree, including you know what the tree issues forth its twigs and branches and leaves. So by knowing the tree of samsara, which represents all of creation, right? The tree of samsara represents all of creation. One who knows the tree of samsara, one who knows all of creation, such a person is called Vedavit, a knower of the Vedas, because along with creation came the Vedas. This is a very traditional teaching. I'll just mention it in passing. People ask, where do these scriptures come from? And of course, we understand everything began with the ancient rishis. But then, how did the ancient rishis receive these teachings? And what is taught again and again is the ancient rishis did not compose those teachings. They discovered teachings which already existed. So what is taught in the most traditional way is that when the universe was created, the Vedas were created along with the universe. The ancient rishis discovered those teachings that were already existent. So this is how all traditional teachers understand the origin of the Vedas. There are other ways of explaining it as well, but this is the most traditional way of explaining it. Along with the universe, the Vedas themselves came into existence, and the rishis discovered that. Okay, let's continue. Now we go into the longer meter with the different mode of chanting. Adashchordvam prasritastasya shaka. Adashchordvam prasritastasya shaka. Guna pravriddha vishaya pravalaha. Guna pravriddha vishaya pravalaha. Adascha mulanyanu santatani. Adascha mulanyanu santatani. Karmanubandhini manushya-loke. Karmanubandhini manushya-loke. So further about that tree of samsara, it's shakaha, its branches. Tasya shakaha. The branches of that tree of samsara are prasritaha. They're spread out. The branches of the tree of samsara are spread out where? They're spread out adaha, below, and urdhvam, above. The branches are spread out below and above. And here we need to start building more of an image in our mind. This peepal tree or this banyan tree, if you see a really old one, many of you have seen in India, really old trees that are just a tangle of branches and roots. So they send down these tap roots, and the branches are all over the place. And if you see a really old tree, it's just an amazingly complex tangle of branches and roots. And this is the image we want to have now as we proceed to understand this symbolism. So that the branches of the tree of samsara, they go both down and above. That suggests both the tangle of branches and roots. Also, the other point that's being made symbolically is some branches go up, some branches go down. Remember, the branches are the manifestation. The unmanifest becoming manifest. The branches that go down represent the manifestation of the world. The branches that go up represent the manifestation of the heavens. Nice. We got branches going up, the heavens. We got branches going down, representing the world in which we live. And all of those branches are Vishaya Pravalaha. This is more symbolism. Pravala is a newborn twig. So you can imagine that twigs, in fact, if you have houseplants, you see how those houseplants, they will send off new shoots this way, that way. They further themselves. In the same way, a tree will create new twigs. A new twig will sprout off of an existing twig. Pravala is a sprout from a twig. It's a newborn twig. And the twigs of this tree are said to be Vishaya, objects. Objects of the world are the twigs of the tree. So we have the leaves of the tree representing the Vedas that protect and sustain the world. The twigs, the newborn twigs of the tree, the symbolism continues. They represent all the objects of the world, which are guna pravriddhaha. Those twigs grow. They become pravriddha. And the growth of those twigs is due to guna, the three gunas, which we've just studied in great detail in the prior chapter. So here he is elaborating on this metaphor. Now we get into the real heart of the matter. And that is, if you're going to introduce some symbolism, it's got to have a purpose. And you'll see the purpose now as we proceed. Adahacha mulani anusantatani. The first verse was talking about was talking about shakaha, the branches. Now we're talking about mulani. You have to break the words apart. Mula, is root. Mulani, plural. You have to break the words apart. So there are many branches, shakaha, plural, in the first line. And in the third line, there are many mulani, many roots. So those branches were prasritaha, were spread out. And in the third line, the roots are anusantatani, also spread out. The branches are spread out. The roots are spread out. And the roots are spread out where you saw the tangle of roots, all of those tap roots coming down in that banyan tree or peepal tree. So it says here, adahacha, below the roots are coming down, and the cha, according to the commentator, means not only down and up. The commentator says that cha means up. So the roots are going down, the roots are going up. The roots are coming down, though, into manushya-loke, into the world of people. That was the symbolism, right? Starting up in the unmanifest, then we come down to the realm of the heavens, then we come down finally to the realm of human beings, this earthly plane. So manushya-loke, in this realm of people, all of those roots extend, and those roots are karma anubandhini. And this is where the metaphor begins to be more of a guide to our spiritual life. The roots of the tree of samsara, first of all, they extend down into our lives, and they are karma anubandhini. They bind us to karma. Now, this is some fundamental symbolism of the tree that's often overlooked, and that is that whole unfoldment from the unmanifest to manifest. Let me put it in more simple terms. Why does a seed sprout? Now, there are various ways of explaining it, and certainly a botanist will have his or her explanation. But from the standpoint of the doctrine of karma, we could say a seed sprouts because of its karma. Just like every living being is governed by karma, which determines how long a living being will live before it dies. And then, when does that seed sprout is like saying, when does a human being who died, when does that person get reborn? Karma. It's determined by the doctrine of karma. So the doctrine of karma determines when a human being gets reborn. Doctrine of karma determines when a seed sprouts. And here, those roots, rooted in the unmanifest, extending into the world of human beings, is discussing the karmas that determine the course of our lives. Yes, it's obscure. This whole metaphor is many people say it's very mystical. Mystical simply means you don't understand it. That's what it means. And I admit, it's not easy to understand, but now we're at a position to get the relevance of this symbolism, whether you understand it or not. So if you don't understand it, it's mystical. If you do understand it, you understand that it represents the unfoldment of human life according to karma. And it says karma anubandha, the bondage of karma. And here's the way to relate it to the metaphor. Again, that tangle of branches and roots. So you got roots down here, you've got the tap roots going down, you've got branches going down, you've got branches going up. You've got this whole tangle of branches and roots. I can imagine that if a bird accidentally flies inside this tree, the bird could have some difficulty finding its way out. You get that idea? So that's what we want to see right now, that tangle of roots and branches going up and down and sideways, and we are trapped in that tangle of roots and branches like that bird who flew inside. This is the idea. The complexity of life, the complexity of karma are shown by the complexity of all those branches and roots all intertwined in that really old tree. And here you have to have that image of an old banyan tree or peepal tree. And you see all of that tangle of roots and branches. Well, a bird can get stuck in that tangle of roots and branches, and all of us are symbolically tangled in that. That's why it's called samsara vriksha. Samsara, we translate it as worldly life, but it carries with it the idea that we are bound to this worldly life and bound by karma. So, due to karma, you took this birth, which in many ways is a wonderful thing. I mean, our lives include so many wonderful, wonderful things, but there is no one's life which is free from suffering. What will it take to become completely free from suffering? Well, here's the problem. Not only is this tree an amazing tangle, which is really hard to get out of, but not only that, this tree is avyayam, it's eternal. So how then to get out of this eternal tangle of karma? And that's a nice way of summarizing this whole symbolism. How to get out of the eternal bondage, the eternal tangle of karma. And that's what we're going to see starting in the next verse, the way out of that tangle. Narupamasyeha tatopalabhyate, narupamasyeha tatopalabhyate, nanto na chadir na cha sampratishta, nanto na chadir na cha sampratishta, Ashvattamenam suvirudhamulham. Ashvattamenam suvirudhamulham. Asanga shastrena dridhena chitva. Asanga shastrena dridhena chitva. Asya rupam. The asya of that samsara vriksha, this tree of worldly life, its rupam, its form, iha, here in the world, na tata upalabhyate. Na upalabhyate. It is not visible, tata, as it is. The form, let me give you the words and then I'll give you the symbolic meaning. The form of the tree of samsara is not visible here in the world, na antaha, nor its end, the end of the tree of samsara, na cha adihi, nor its beginning is not visible, na sampratishta, nor its middle, its continuity. The beginning, middle, and end, of this tree of samsara are not visible. Its form is not visible here in the world. Again, it's more, you remember our cop-out. Oh, it's mystical. Well, we can do a little better than that. Let's try to do a little better than that. And we can find two fairly obvious meanings. Why is it not visible, this tree of samsara? One obvious meaning is it's a symbol. The symbolic tree is now, don't think you're going to walk around and see a tree with the roots up in the sky and the branches down below. So it's a symbol. As a symbolic tree, it is not visible here in the world. So that's one way of understanding what Sri Krishna is saying in this verse. There's another way, I think a more subtle and important way of it. Remember we said that samsara vriksha, extending up into the unmanifest, coming down manifest into the world of human beings, the world of karma. We said that tree represents the tangled bondage of karma in which we all live. Is karma visible? Karma affects us every day. There are so many factors that affect us every day. So many factors are known to us, but many factors are not known to us. And many of those unknown, unseen factors that affect us are due to karma. That's very significant in our lives, but they're not visible to us. They can't be predicted. They can't be foreseen until they occur. When those remember, karma means the unfructified result of past deeds. For shorthand, we call that karma. But what does that karma mean? The unfructified results, the pending results, the results of past deeds which have been committed, but results which have not yet become manifest, not yet fructified. So from that standpoint, the tree of this samsara vriksha, the tree of samsara, represents that tangle of the tangle of karma that binds us to life, and that tangle meaning complicated and it's unseen. That's what he wants to say. Sri Krishna says that tangle of karma, the complex karmas that are going to affect us at various points throughout this life, rupam asya na upalabhyate. You can't see it, you can't predict it, you can't see or predict the beginning, middle, or end of those karmas. So that's the second way of understanding that. So I guess we need not say it's mystical. We can find some proper meaning in that. Now, this third line, enam ashwatam, this ashwata tree, this tree of worldly life, this tree of samsara, is suvirudha moolam. Its mula, its roots, are suvirudha, very well established. Its roots are very well established. We can't say deeply established, because where are the roots? So we can say very firmly established. These roots are very firmly established. We said before, symbolically in the manifest, but now to make it more relevant. How many prior lives have you had? We've had those of you who have studied with me or elsewhere properly the doctrine of karma. You know that according to a proper understanding of the doctrine of karma, we have all had an infinite number of prior lives. There was no first birth for any being. That would actually violate the doctrine of karma. So therefore, and we say life is cyclical. Cycle by definition doesn't begin, right? A circle has no beginning or end. So this cycle of birth and rebirth has no beginning. So therefore, if it's had no beginning, how many prior lives have you had? Infinite. In those infinite number of prior lives, how much karma have you managed to accumulate? That's right. In an infinite number of prior lives, you have accumulated, there's good news and bad news. Good news is you've accumulated an infinite amount of punya karma. And the not so good news is, obviously, you've accumulated an infinite amount of papa karma. That infinite accumulation of good and bad karmas, we call it sanchita karma. Many of you are familiar with that nomenclature. That's the technical word for the infinite accumulation of past karmas. That sanchita karma is not responsible for this life, because that sanchita karma is infinite. If that sanchita karma caused this life, you'd have to live an infinite length of time to exhaust all those karmas. So therefore, this life is not the result of infinite sanchita karma, but a finite subset of that infinite sanchita karma. And the name for that finite subset is called prarabdha karma. Prarabdha karma is that finite subset of the infinite accumulation sanchita karma. But the problem is this: when your prarabdha karma is exhausted, you die and get reborn into another life of suffering. How to avoid getting reborn into a life of suffering? Well, that process of rebirth is based on an infinite accumulation of karma, which is what's referred to here as suvirudha moolam. The moolam here, we'll reinterpret mula as the root cause for rebirth. The root cause for rebirth is karma. And those karmas are infinite in number. Therefore, suvirudha moolam, the root cause for getting born again and again, is suvirudha, deeply rooted, firmly rooted in an infinite accumulation of past karmas. We're really stuck. How to get out of this? So you've got this amazingly complex tree with all the branches and roots. Severing all those branches and roots won't be easy. But can be done, right? So all those branches and roots form this incredibly complex, this old banyan tree or old peepal tree. It's got this tangle of roots, but Sri Krishna gives us some hope here, and it says that even though this tree, the third line, even though this tree of samsara is deeply rooted, firmly rooted, it says, asanga shastrena dridhena chitwa, the roots chitwa, having been cut. Having been cut means the roots can be cut. How can those roots be cut? Asanga shastrena. Shastra here means some weapon, an axe. What kind of axe? This is symbolism now. So you don't chop down a symbolic tree with a real axe. Make sense? You have to chop down a symbolic tree with a symbolic axe. And the symbolic axe here is Asanga Shastra, the axe of detachment. Dridhena, a strong axe of detachment, our symbolic axe. What is he talking about? Well, it's mystical. We can leave it there or make some effort to understand what in the world he's talking about. And this is even more tricky because now we're beginning to leave the symbolism behind and enter the world of sadhana, the world of spiritual practice. So that tree of worldly life, samsara vriksha, represents the tangle of karma which traps us in this continuing cycle of birth and rebirth, a cycle which is suviruddha, firmly established because it's based on an infinite accumulation of karma. And it seems impossible to get out of it. If again, think if you were in India someplace and you saw this 200-year-old banyan tree with hundreds or thousands of roots and branches, and you've got your little axe. And you're going to chop it down. No way. I mean, from that, it looks absolutely hopeless if you want to chop down that tree with this little axe in your hand. But now we have to shift our view into what the symbolism is meant to represent. So that tree, set aside the physical tree now, and let's reflect on the metaphoric tree, the symbolic tree, the tangle of karma in which we are bound. That tree would be hard, a real tree would be hard to chop down. But this tangle of karma can be cut. There is a way out. What is the way out? And here we need some important Vedanta. What is the way out? Let me just see if I want to see part of that. Okay. What is the way out? So if you have an infinite accumulation of karma, what is the way out? What is the way to become free from rebirth? I think you'll admit, from that standpoint, there is no way out. From the standpoint of the doctrine of karma, there is no way out. Which means there's a nice modern expression, I think you all know it, you have to think about it differently. You have to think about it out of the box. Here's a situation where we require out-of-the-box thinking. From the standpoint of the doctrine of karma, there is no solution, full stop. But with some out-of-the-box thinking, according to Sri Krishna, you can cut at the root of karma. What is the root of karma? I'm going to go to the board and show you something that I think we've seen before. Let me push the right button here. Yeah. So we have this tree of samsara. By the way, is it okay if I draw right side up instead of upside? I'm not good at drawing anyway. And if I try to draw things upside down, nothing's going to come. So anyway, we're dealing with the tree of worldly life, the tree which we said represents the tangle of karma which has entrapped us. What is the root of this karma? Well, why do we engage in any action at all? Why do we engage in deliberate, willful karmas? Why did you come to class this morning? And a simple answer is, you wanted to, which means the cause for karma is kama, desire. Desire is the direct and immediate cause for karma. So, if you want to get rid of all karmas, stop doing anything. But in order to stop doing anything, you have to be free from desire. How will you be free from desire? We've had this discussion several times over the years, and I've joked with you, if you are a tea drinker and you decide, I want to, first of the year, my New Year's resolution, I drink too much tea, I'm going to stop drinking tea. So, starting with January 1st, you stop drinking tea. January 1st comes and goes, no tea. January 2nd comes and goes, no tea. Tell me, what are you thinking about all day long on January 1st and January 2nd? Because you can stop the action of drinking tea, you cannot willfully stop the desire for tea. So that strategy doesn't work. So Sri Krishna says, you need a sharp axe. What are you going to chop at? You can't chop at the karma because you have kama. And you can't, as I just said in the example of the January 1st resolution, you can't just chop off desires. It doesn't work. It's a failed strategy. But yet he says, you have to have this axe of detachment, asanga shastra. Let me show you why that works. Here's where it works. Why do you have kama? Now we have to finish this Vedantic analysis of the tree of samsara. Why do you have desire in the first? I'm just looking and say I'm walking off the screen. So, why do you have desire in the first place? If you knew your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, if you knew the inner divinity, that's the essence of your nature, if you knew yourself to be full and complete and in essence pure peace and contentment, if you knew that, if you discovered that about yourself, would you worry so much about tea? Or anything else for that matter? So this is the point, and that is, desire is the result of what my guru brilliantly called self-non-recognition. The failure to recognize your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, as that inner divinity, the failure to recognize your true nature. Self-non-recognition, which is a very clear word, but what it means ultimately is, let me use the Sanskrit word, which is avidya. Avidya, ignorance. Ignorance. Self-non-recognition. Failure to recognize your innate fullness and completeness gives rise to kama, gives rise to karma, and further entrapment in that tangle of karma. Now, we have our symbolic acts. It is the acts of detachment. How will we apply that acts of, what are we going to cut with that acts of detachment? And this is much more subtle than you think. We've already said you can't just stop acting. And we've just discussed you can't just stop desiring things. And here's the problem. If you're in a state of ignorance, so let's be very clear. This is a little subtle. Who is wielding this acts of detachment is one who wants to be enlightened, meaning one who is not yet enlightened. The wielder of the acts of detachment is a spiritual seeker. Mumukshu, one who wants liberation. Now, since we've identified that one wielding the acts of detachment is not enlightened, this ignorance is still present. If you know your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, who needs the axe? Who cares about the tree? Let it be. Not hurting you at all. If you are Satchidananda Atma, let that tree of ignorance, that tree of worldly life, let it be. Who cares? But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the mumukshu, the spiritual seeker, the one seeking freedom from suffering, which means they are still in a state of ignorance, but they can wield the acts of detachment. What will you cut with that acts of detachment? And here's the key to today's class. That gets cut, but not in the ordinary way. I just said that if you want tea, you can stop drinking the tea, but you can't stop the desire for tea. But now, let's change that story. Suppose you have figured out that your lack of self-control is an impediment to moksha. Suppose you have understood that you have a pattern of just doing whatever you feel like doing. You have no discipline. In Sanskrit, they call it dhamma. Shama, dhamma, uparati, titiksha, shraddha, samadhanam. These are 6 qualities which are essential for preparing you for gaining enlightenment. One of which is dhamma, self-control. Suppose you decide that you want to cultivate dhamma for the sake of enlightenment. Now, please differentiate this from a prior example. And that is, you decided to stop drinking tea on January 1st. Why? You have this funny idea. I'm a spiritual person, and spiritual people don't drink tea. What is that? That's silly. That's absolutely silly. Okay. But suppose that's the basis for your quitting tea. Well, that doesn't work. What does work is this dridha, strong, sangha shastra, the strong symbolic acts of detachment. If you find yourself without enough self-control, if you recognize that is lack of self-control is preventing you from advancing on your spiritual path, a path towards moksha. Now, it's not about tea, nor is it about the image of being spiritual, whatever that means. Now it's about moksha. when you identify the lack of self-control as being an obstacle to you gaining moksha, now you're highly motivated to cultivate self-control, and you might even decide on January 1st to stop drinking tea, not because drinking tea is non-spiritual, but because you want to cultivate self-control. Do you see the difference between the two scenarios? To cultivate self-control for the sake of enlightenment means you use the acts of detachment, asanga. Asanga means detachment. You use that strong acts of detachment to not remove desire, but to cope with unfulfilled desire. So that you don't drink the tea, you still want the tea, but you don't act on that desire because you have chopped it with that asanga shastra. I'm not even sure this cutting thing, I'm not sure exactly where to cut. Let's cut here instead. You're cutting through this kama. This is not correct. Let me erase that and let's finish up this class. So, you cut kama, let me put it this way. This will help. Not as an act of will. An act of sheer will cannot ultimately win a contest with kama. This is not based on will. This is based on value. When you have a value for moksha, then cultivating self-control is something you can work on. But it's driven not by sheer will, it's driven by your value for moksha. That asanga shastra, the acts of detachment, represents your commitment based on your value for gaining moksha. Let me describe it just a little bit more. And then it's time we have to wrap up our class. Where am I here? Okay, here's the idea. If you go on a diet, it's a good example. It may be better than this tea example. If you go on a diet, the success of your diet will depend tremendously on your attitude. If you're on a diet because you think you don't look good, that may not sustain your diet. If you go on a diet because your doctor says you have to go on a diet, that may not sustain your diet. But if you go on a diet because you personally have a value for being healthy, see the difference? So this is vanity. I want to look good. Or the other one, the doctor wagging his finger at you, that's for almost no one does that work. So a diet may be successful if you personally have a strong value for being healthy. That strong value for being healthy here represents our asanga shastra, this sword of detachment. The sword of detachment means to recognize the impossibility of becoming free from suffering through any kind of worldly effort, and recognizing that only through a process of spiritual growth can you become free from suffering. I'll say that one more time. I'm describing now this asanga shastra, the sword of detachment. What is that sword of detachment? That sword of detachment is the recognition that you will never become free from suffering through worldly efforts, but you can become free from suffering through a process of spiritual growth. That is the Asanga Shastra that can ultimately free you from this tangle of karma. In the next 2 or 3 verses, Sri Krishna is going to describe how that process works. So this is a good place to wrap up for today. When we continue next time, we'll see how is that Asanga Shastra, that acts of detachment, how is it used to free you from this tangle of karma, which has been symbolically represented here as that tree of samsara. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Hamratangamaya.